All right, our ranks seem to have thinned out again. You are the few and the proud, and you will again attend an extremely important lecture, which I hope that you will all remember, and of course will all benefit you on the midterm exam. So where we left off, I believe Hitler had just been named Chancellor. Now, it's interesting that because there had been so many changes of government in the past 5, even 10 years in Germany, there was even at the time, there was kind of it was sort of a running joke, like in the theater. You know, they would inject lines about the contemporary scene. You know, let's say in an opera, someone would turn to someone else and say, "I say we dissolve the Reichstag and form a new government." It had literally become like a running joke that there are so many governments, so many elections. Everyone was kind of sick and tired of it. In fact, oddly enough, people didn't think it was very big news. There's an interesting story that back then they would sometimes show. I guess today when we watch a movie, we're forced to sit through, what, about 30 or 40 commercials, advertisements. Back then they wouldn't do advertisements. They would do like a film short or a newsreel. And it's interesting that the newsreel they were showing in German cinemas, the week Hitler was named Chancellor, they mentioned the fact that Hitler was the new Chancellor, but that was item number 6. Behind a bunch of like sports news, you know, about like the football teams, there was a horse show, there was some kind of a ski race, and then, oh, by the way, Hitler was named Chancellor. People didn't really think necessarily that it mattered that much. You remember I talked about how the socialist parties, including also the communists, because of their materialistic conception of history, which of course came from the dialectical materialism, Marxism, etc., they thought Hitler was just kind of a front man. So they thought that the real leading force behind the government was this guy Hugenberg, who you've probably never heard of. But back then they thought he was like the man. He got the economics ministry and the finance ministry. So all the political cartoons would show, you know, this tiny little Hitler in the back of the car, and Hugenberg was the one actually driving. Because after all, he was the capitalist. He was the one with the money. He was the one who controlled, supposedly, the economics and finance ministry. And then there was Franz von Papen, the recent chancellor, the one who had, after all, convinced President Hindenburg to name Hitler chancellor. Everyone thought he was the real mastermind of the operation. That's why they were all saying, we're going to fight the coming dictatorship of Franz von Papen. Now, it's interesting that Papen and Hugenberg themselves, I don't know if they necessarily read the socialist press, but they had a similar idea. They thought they had, as they put it, boxed Hitler in. After all, the Nazis only had 3 positions in the cabinet out of about 11 or 12, depending on how you count. Hitler was, of course, Chancellor. Wilhelm Frick was in charge of the Ministry of the Interior, which is to say also the Justice Department. And then there was Hermann Göring, a kind of somewhat notorious Göring, who was, quote, minister without portfolio. But Hitler had insisted very strongly on this point. He would also be given control of the Prussian Interior Ministry. Now, Prussia, remember, was the largest state in Germany, in a way the original state which had created Germany. It had the largest population by far, and more significantly, if you may remember from the previous lecture, it also had the largest police force. A force which was in fact second only to the army in terms of its size and effective striking power. So that Göring, in effect, was given potential control over the Prussian police. Now, that aside, Hugenberg controlled the 2 economics and finance ministries. Papen was vice-chancellor with also a kind of unofficial role as advisor to the president. So they said, we've got Hitler boxed in. We'll control him. Somewhat more notoriously, Franz von Papen said, the very day Hitler was named chancellor, in 2 months, Hitler will be pushed so far into a corner that he'll squeal. We've got the measure of the man. Well, these are, of course, famous last words of a rather classic variety. The utter and incredible falsity of this interpretation of the situation. It's astonishing to us in retrospect. I suppose it's understandable at the time, particularly people who had been reading the newspapers who tended to believe this stuff about, you know, Hitler being the tool of capitalists. They didn't believe that he really controlled his own destiny, that he really was his own man. In fact, he was very much his own man. From the very first day, he announced the first thing that he did, and this was quite important. He announced that they would hold new elections. Now, this seems somewhat paradoxical because just a week before, the Nazis had been terrified of having new elections. If you remember, they had been losing members, the SA, the stormtroopers I wrote them up here, of Ernst Röhm, the kind of brown-shirted thugs. They were hemorrhaging members. Their morale was poor. They couldn't recruit new people. They weren't getting paid. They'd wasted all their money on all the elections of 1932. So the last thing they wanted was new elections. But that was before Hitler was chancellor. Now, Hitler as chancellor could invoke Article 48, a kind of presidential emergency decree inside the Weimar Constitution, which would allow him to, how did they put it, prohibit the publication of media which insulted or brought into contempt the state. Now, theoretically, that is, it was a nonpartisan thing, right? Anyone who kind of insulted the German state or the German people. Not unlike, Article 304 of the Turkish Constitution, the notorious article regarding the insulting of Turkishness. It was similarly vague. That is, it could be applied however one wanted. Hitler, of course, applied this to mean anyone who was against the Nazis. And so he immediately started shutting down the opposition media, including all of the papers of the socialists and the communists, on the grounds that, well, after all, you could make the argument they were Marxists, they were revolutionaries, they were opposed to law and order, so after all, you might as well shut down their papers. So Hitler immediately, that is, moved against the opposition media. He now also had control of essentially the state bureaucracy. He had access to state funds, which he could use for his campaign, and not least, the imposition of Hermann Göring in the Prussian Interior Ministry meant that he could now use the Prussian police to intimidate and silence opponents. Now, only about 10 months ago, the Prussian Interior Ministry had been controlled by the Social Democrats. The Nazis now had total and unfettered control, which was established immediately as Hermann Göring went about purging the upper ranks of anyone who was loyal to the Republic, anyone who was sympathetic with the socialists or the communists, or even just a kind of fair play generally. As Göring put it in his first speech to the policemen, he said, "It is not my business to do justice. It is my business to annihilate and exterminate. That's all." What did he mean by that? Well, he put it even more colorfully. He said, any bullet fired from one of your guns is a bullet from my gun. In other words, you can shoot whomever you like, and I'll stand by you. Implied, of course, was that the police could now essentially fire at will. If there were a street protest, a demonstration, if the communists got uppity, it was more or less kind of free reign. It's interesting that all of this stuff actually predated the notorious Reichstag fire. It had all begun already before the Reichstag fire. Now, a word about the Reichstag fire itself. It was absolutely a cardinal event of the 20th century. It marked, in a way, the point of no return for the rule of law in Germany, democratic institutions, freedom of the speech, assembly, etc. It eventually had impacts, as we will see, in the communist world as well. It's curious because historians and forensic investigators argued this for years. The assumption among most, shall we say, reasonable people ever since is that the Nazis set the fire themselves. Now, curiously, this was actually never proven. And the best circumstantial evidence suggests that, in fact, the Nazis did not set the fire. We do know the man who was discovered, I mean, literally in the building, with the materials on him, with his shirt off, you know, dripping with sweat, which was like pouring off of him because the fire had already begun. And that was this curious Dutch ex-communist called Marinus van der Lubbe. He wasn't even a communist anymore. He was like a former communist who had left the party about 4 years ago. He was obviously a little bit cracked in the head. That is, he was not fully in possession of his faculties. We do know, though, that this was not an isolated incident. He had, in fact, already been once convicted and then let go on a charge of attempted arson. And he had apparently set fires previously in other kind of public buildings in Germany and somehow escaped. So he was definitely guilty. Of course, the larger question was, who was he working with? Did he have help? And this is where everyone always assumed that he had been kind of planted by the Nazis. Hermann Göring, supposedly in his office in the Prussian Interior Ministry, there were like these underground tunnels in between it and the building of the Reichstag, so that the assumption was, he had sent his men in to set the fire, and then they emerged, back out later on with their hands clean. Forensic investigators in the 60s later checked out this rumor, and they determined that, in fact, that was not realistic, that it could not have been done in the way people claimed. So anyway, the latest sort of interpretation evidence is that probably Marinus van der Lubbe acted more or less alone. Again, a little bit like Lee Harvey Oswald and JFK, there are other theories, but so far the most plausible explanation is that he acted alone. Now that said, for the intents and purposes of totalitarian politics, it was in a way irrelevant whether or not he was guilty. The fact that he was an ex-communist was all the Nazis needed. True, he was no longer a communist, but well, he was a communist of sorts, and so they said, okay, we're going to go get the communists. As Hermann Göring put it, a man, shall we say, who did not mince his words. He said, and I quote, and this is actually the very night of the fire, the 28th of February. He clambers over the fire hoses. There's smoke around him. He's actually in front of the Reichstag building, and he says into the microphone, and I quote, "The German people will not put up with leniency. Every communist functionary will be shot wherever we find him. The communist deputies of the Reichstag must be hanged tonight. Everyone in alliance with the communists is to be arrested." Now, it's interesting that there were elections scheduled 5 days after this, and that, in fact, the communists not only were represented in the Reichstag, but were one of the leading parties in the Reichstag. So communists around Germany were now presented with a rather interesting situation. If you could somehow get yourself elected, again, re-elected, and make it to the Reichstag building, or wherever they were going to hold parliament now that the Reichstag building was burned down, you'd probably be safe, because after all, you were an elected official. On the other hand, the Nazis could just shoot you if they found you. And so what do? The communists, remember, had been told by their own newspapers as recently as a month ago, that Hitler was no real threat to them. That, in fact, it was a great thing that Hitler was now in power because it would be the inevitable prelude to the workers' revolution. And now the communists all have to go in hiding. Many of them went to Czechoslovakia, to Prague. Many of them went into France. Many of them really were shot, although we don't know how many. Some of them, amazingly, actually made it to, it wasn't the Reichstag building because it was now burned down. They had the actual sessions of the new Reichstag in the Kroll Opera House. Even the socialists were at risk, although they were not supposedly legally targeted by this. But meanwhile, the Reichstag fire had already given Hitler the pretext to ask the president Hindenburg for emergency powers. The emergency decree, which was actually published later that night, the same day, 28 February 1933, it was a decree, quote, "for the protection of the people and state against betrayal of the German people and treasonable machinations." The key passage reads as follows. Articles 114 to 118, 123 to 4, and 153 of the Constitution of the German Reich are nullified. Consequently, curbs on personal liberty, on the right of free expression of opinion, including freedom of the press, associations, assembly, surveillance over letters, telegrams, and telephone communications, searches of homes and confiscations of, as well as restrictions on property, are hereby permissible beyond the limits hitherto established by law. In other words, no one had any rights any longer. The state, the Prussian police, which now sort of begins to morph into its notorious appellation as the Gestapo, or the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret sort of branch of the Prussian Interior Ministry. All of this actually dates to the night of the Reichstag fire. This emergency decree was in effect until 1945. Effectively, the Constitution was suspended for the whole 12 years of the Third Reich. It's interesting because sometimes people somewhat erroneously believe that this was actually carried out by the so-called enabling law, or the Ermäßigungsgesetz, which was passed by the Reichstag after it convened in the Kroll Opera House. This decree essentially was one in which the Reichstag abolished its own powers. It said, we no longer have any authority and the Chancellor can now do what he wants, is pretty much what it said. But curiously, it was kind of unnecessary because the emergency decree had already done this. What the enabling law really did, it was more symbolic. It was a way of Hitler getting the politicians themselves to endorse what he had already gotten the president to do, which is to suspend all civil liberties and political freedoms. He actually got the parliament to vote this. Now, how free that vote is was, of course, another question. It's interesting that the elections held on 5 March 1933, the last even somewhat free elections held in Germany in the Nazi era. Although, again, how free is another question. The Nazis had already begun shooting communists on sight. They had shut down all opposition media. They were intimidating opponents. Even so, they did not get 50% of the vote. They had already terrorized the opposition, and yet they got only 43.7% of the vote, which was not that much higher than what they had got the previous summer. So it's interesting that you can say on the one hand, well, this 43.7% of the public was somehow complicit in all of the crimes which followed. But even if you were to say that and not give the benefit of the doubt to people who voted because they were scared, it remains true that more than half of the German people voted against Hitler even after he had begun to terrorize the opposition. Now, the only reason these arguments are interesting, when you get into questions of war guilt in the Nuremberg trials, there was a book published about 15 years ago by a man called Daniel Goldhagen called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And the basic idea was that the Germans were all guilty. This is the kind of thing which kind of matters in a way, if you think about that. A lot of Germans were never complicit in the Nazi regime. They never voted for it. Some of them even opposed it and, of course, paid with their lives. But that said, Hitler got what he wanted. The Reichstag met. Very few communist deputies showed up, for obvious reasons, because they were afraid of being shot. Socialists, also many of them did not show up, but some of them did, and they actually voted against the enabling law. It was, in the end, able to pass by the requisite, I believe, 2/3 majority, because the Nazis had the other parties in their pocket, and also because they had surrounded the parliament with brown-shirted thugs who were threatening everyone's lives. And even the Nazi parliamentary deputies were basically thugs who were pretty much intimidating everyone else. So that the scenes in the chamber were rather violent. Interestingly, though, Hitler did actually appear before the chamber, and he actually made an argument. And so you can say that in a certain sense, he won. And legally, in some kind of way, even if problematically, Hitler got the parliament to abolish its own powers with the enabling law. Now, in some ways more lasting and more enduring and more interesting was the process which ensued next, which is usually described by the German phrase of Gleichschaltung, which is difficult to translate. It has a certain connotation of, it could be something like equality, except that it is actually more like a kind of melting together or almost self-annihilation of institutions, everything being brought into the same kind of framework, which is to say basically that political parties, other than the Nazis, were now abolished, along with their associations, the various clubs and the paramilitary groups, all the things that the other political parties did, free associations of a semi-political or non-political nature. Everything was now brought under the umbrella of the Nazi Party in one way or another, so that everyone theoretically was supposed to belong. That is, they belonged to this or that association, which made them part of this new sort of a state. Now, curiously, it sounds rather creepy to me, as it does to most people. But a lot of Germans, I think, in a curious, almost paradoxical way, actually went along with this. Probably not more than 50%, but enough of them went along with it so that it worked pretty well. And part of the reason, actually, is that there was a long tradition in German politics of essentially not liking politics. I mean, there are these interesting quotes that you hear from like the earliest days of elections being held in Germany in the late 19th century where, these women would write into newspapers and say, could we please get rid of these stupid elections? They're just making everyone angry and getting people all riled up in the streets. The non-political or apolitical tradition in Germany was always very strong. So that, in a curious way, abolishing all the other political parties, even though it was totalitarian and intimidating, was also oddly reassuring to a lot of Germans. It was like Hitler had just abolished politics. There was an interesting quote from a later era, actually the Cold War era, of an African Marxist. It might have been Julius Nyerere, who was trying to explain to an Englishman why he had abolished all other political parties other than his own. And he said, well, in Europe you have all these political parties and they all argue all the time and there's friction and there's tension. And see, in our country there are different opinions, but we just put them all in one party. And that way everyone gets along. That's kind of what the Nazis did. They essentially abolished dissent. They abolished other political parties. And in that way they created the illusion of consensus. Now, they didn't do this, of course, without knocking some heads together. I've already explained how they began shooting communists on sight or arresting them, arresting socialists. The rounding up of political enemies began almost immediately after. Some of it was even before the Reichstag fire, as I said, but the serious measures took place after the Reichstag fire, after the Ermäßigungsgesetz. But it was all really underway by spring 1933. Again, within weeks, within months of Hitler coming to power, he was not pushed so far into a corner that he would squeal. Rather, he pushed everyone else into that corner, and everyone else squealed for help. They had already begun rounding up socialists, communists, opposition journalists, people who, for one reason or another, complained, protested, whatever. What did they do with them? Well, there was a kind of extra-legal limbo. I mean, they still had a Justice Department, they still had courts, but they weren't really holding trials for most of these people. Instead, what they did with most of them is they sent them to concentration camps. Dachau was kind of the first and most famous of these. But Dachau, it's interesting because it's the most visited of the Nazi camps. It's right outside Munich. So it's like part of the tour, if you go see Munich. The thing about Dachau, though, is it was also the nicest of the camps. It was actually the one where they treated people the best. Most of the camps were a lot less nice than Dachau. People were worked, many of them. They weren't killed right away, but many of them began to die kind of quietly. Sometimes they were deliberately they would take like an intellectual and, force them to do manual labor in some humiliating way, like licking the streets clean with your tongue, that sort of thing. So yeah, people started disappearing, basically. The other thing which began happening, which was to a certain sensibility even more outrageous, was, of course, the burning of books. And this is something which is one of the most lasting images of the Nazi era from German times. They literally would get together, and the first book burning was actually held in Berlin, across from the Humboldt University, right where, if you go to Berlin today, it's where the old Chancellor's office was. It was where Liebknecht proclaimed the Republic in 1918. It was where the Chancellor actually sat for most of the 90s before they built the new chancellery. So right there in this famous square in the heart of Berlin, they threw books onto a bonfire. Communist books, Marxist books, books that were called degenerate because they had certain kind of modern or postmodern sensibilities. Maybe they were pornographic. There were all kinds of categories, but they would throw these books into this great big bonfire. So you have this really kind of creeping totalitarian rule, which is basically all in place by May 1933, within several months of Hitler coming to power. Now, it's interesting how Hitler had kind of come up with these ideas, how he became quite so, shall we say, cruel, but also kind of visionary. I put on the board, because I'm going to look at Stalin in a moment, the notion that they were parallel lives of a sort, the sense that they were actually learning from each other. Now, as Hitler put it kind of interestingly, he said, he was confessing to one of his kind of aides, he said, I learned a lot from the Marxists, not from their boring materialist conception of history, but from their methods, he said. That is, basically turning politics into war, rounding up your political opponents, killing your political opponents, rounding up whole categories of people. The anti-Semitic laws didn't really begin right away, but even so, there was persecution of the Jews in the streets. They began taking Jews and they would have to put, like the Star of David on, the yellow star, so that you could tell where the Jews were, so that you could see them basically walking around. At one point, they even had, no Jews allowed signs put outside certain towns. It wasn't all systematic yet in the way it would later be, but it was all pretty much there by 1933. So Hitler learned a lot from Stalin. Now, in the end, Stalin learned from Hitler too, but it's interesting to note that at least in the biggest leap of, shall we say, extra legality or outright state violence and cruelty, Hitler actually did leap first. Now, again, this was all pretty bad, the rounding up of political opponents in camps. All of it, again, kind of went back to, you might say, Stalin, or at least Lenin, had anticipated a lot of this in the Red Terror with what they did with counter-revolutionaries and so on. But Hitler was thinking about something else at the time. There was still one problem he had to deal with. He had gotten rid of most political opposition. He had gotten rid of certainly all serious political opposition. He had gotten rid of all the paramilitary groups of the communists and socialists which opposed him. He hadn't completely gotten control over the military yet. And there was one thing standing in his way. That was the SA. Now, the stormtroopers, they had been a huge part of the Nazi story from the beginning, in particular Ernst Röhm. Röhm was one of Hitler's oldest friends, one of the first people to flock to his banner way back in the early 1920s. Röhm in the SA represented a kind of almost revolutionary impulse inside the Nazi party. Revolutionary because they were not in the regular army, even though many of them had served in the regular army. They had their own uniforms, their own ritual, their own drill, which was a little bit more plebeian. Not necessarily proletarian in the Marxist sense, but it was not the kind of aristocratic code of honor that they had in the Prussian officer corps. Courage, even a certain brutality was emphasized. A kind of social, almost quasi-lower class solidarity was there. There was a kind of homosexual element which was never completely missing. Röhm himself was gay, as were a lot of the leading figures in the SA. It's arguable how significant it was, but it definitely had something to do with the kind of extreme solidarity of the SA, particularly in the upper level. It was a strange institution. It was a military which was not a military. And by 1933-34, it was larger than the military. Remember that the German army was limited by the Versailles Treaty to only 100,000 men. The SA by this point had 1 million active members and about 3.5 million reserves. So potentially, at least, it was 30 or 40 times larger than the army. It was, in other words, a serious threat, not least to simple law and order, because they're all out in the streets brawling all the time. It was also, shall we say, not great for the public image of the regime. A lot of these guys were thuggish, badly educated, not well spoken. Röhm himself came from the army. I mean, he was like a serious man, but a lot of the lower ranking members of the SA were thugs. They were, of course, despised and resented by the actual military. Now, it's interesting that the SA, to a certain extent, represented what you might call, I mean, if you remember the term, National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. There was always an element of socialism. It had been especially associated with the figure of Gregor Strasser, whose base was in kind of northern Germany, Hamburg, the more industrial parts of Germany that had a lot of workers. His brother Otto Strasser had actually left the party and then tried to splinter it in two, so that there was a kind of workers' quasi-proletarian ethos to it. Hitler, if you remember, had never completely gone along with this. In fact, he had confessed to Gregor Strasser at one point that he had no intention of really nationalizing German industry because he needed it. Now, you can see where I'm going with this. The same issue related to the SA, to the stormtroopers. Röhm and a lot of members of the SA wanted to become the real German army. Some of them even harked back to the tradition of the French Revolution, thinking, well, look, we'll be a revolutionary army, just like the French had been. We will be unstoppable because we will have this ethos that is of kind of brotherhood, of a German National Socialist kind of solidarity that will enable us to defeat everyone. And after all, we're bigger than the regular army, we might as well take over. Hitler didn't agree. Hitler thought the lack of discipline, the kind of bad public image created by their thuggery in the streets, all of this in the long run was not helping his purposes. His ultimate purpose, of course, was to wage a war of conquest. And to wage a war of conquest, he thought he needed the real German army, the real discipline of the German army, in the same way that he knew he needed German industry. He didn't want to wreck it, he wanted to milk it. So that he did not necessarily believe in the aristocratic ethos of the Prussian officer corps, but he needed it. Because the German army, as we all know, is a formidable military machine. And Hitler didn't want anything gumming up its works. So gradually, Hitler began plotting against the SA. He built up the SS. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, it's sometimes falsely been called a simple bodyguard for Hitler. I mean, in the end, they had about 100,000 and then several 100,000 men. That's a bit large to be a personal bodyguard. There was a unit inside the SS, which was Hitler's personal bodyguard. But what the SS really represented was, it was kind of like somewhere in between the SA and the regular army. It was more like these proper bourgeois or even aristocratic men leading a paramilitary group, which was classier, not necessarily less cruel than the SA, but certainly classier in its rituals. Its uniforms were a bit smarter. They were basically black instead of brown. And ultimately, it was intensely personally loyal to its chief, Heinrich Himmler, who was loyal to Hitler. Now, Hitler built up the SS gradually, at first secretly. Once he thought it was large and strong enough, once it had sort of wormed its way into, it had surveillance over the SA, it had contacts in the military, it seemed to be secure in its position, Hitler began plotting his most audacious move yet, which we usually refer to as the Night of the Long Knives. That was kind of the name they gave it in almost like Nazi party lore. So what was it literally? Well, it was a purge of the SA. It was a bit more than that, though. It was Hitler settling scores with old enemies. Now, Ernst Röhm, though, is in many ways the important figure because he was not only the head of the SA, but as I have said, he was a close personal friend of Hitler's. Hitler personally arrested Röhm. And I don't just mean personally arrested him. I mean he went to Ernst Röhm's house in the middle of the night with his SA bodyguards. And he himself took his own hands, he roused him out of bed, he started sort of shaking him and then threw him into the arms of the men who would execute him. That is, he got rid of his own best friend, in a way, to the extent Hitler had any friends. A lot of the other members of the SA were also deeply loyal to Hitler. Hitler had them shot anyway, out of hand, no trial. Hitler also simply used the kind of smokescreen of the Night of the Long Knives to settle score with other old enemies, including Gregor Strasser, who you might remember as the kind of second most powerful Nazi because he had the northern labor part of the party. He had been the man that Kurt von Schleicher, the last chancellor, had tried to use to weaken the Nazis. So Hitler, of course, also killed Schleicher, along with Schleicher's wife, along with one of Schleicher's fellow generals who had kind of collaborated with him when he was chancellor. So 2 generals. The reason that's significant is because the whole thing was cooked up in order to please the military. The military connived in the Night of the Long Knives, or at the very least, they did not intervene. They connived, that is, in the outright extrajudicial murder of 2 of their fellow officers. This was, shall we say, not a good sign for the German military in its so-called code of honor. They acquiesced in the Night of the Long Knives, which was very much intended to win over the loyalty of the army. It was carried out really with only a few weeks left in the life of President von Hindenburg, who by this point was so senile that on his deathbed he actually addressed Hitler as "Your Majesty." So now, not only had Hitler gotten rid of his opposition, but he'd also gotten rid of his friends. Or that is to say, he had gotten rid of many of the men who had helped put him in power. This is what Stalin learned from. Now, it's interesting that there's a kind of personal element here, where you can see that both Hitler and Stalin had an episode shortly before this period. I'll tell you what, I think I'm going to take a short break here, because I want to do a little break in between Hitler and Stalin. What time is it? Yeah, I think I'm just going to cut it off here, because I've got a lot to cover on Stalin. So we'll do about a slightly shorter break than usual, like a 5-minute break. Yeah, because I don't want to get going in Stalin and then have to cut it off 20 minutes later. So we're going to do a short 5-minute break.